Welcome in. I'm Collette Wieland alongside Dr. Stephen Camarata. Steve is a best-selling author, child development expert, especially when it comes to how children learn to talk. Today we're going to talk about something that's actually been on my mind for a long time, because when the pandemic started, I had a toddler and a preschool age child. And so I want to talk about the impact of the pandemic on language and late talkers. So first of all, Steve, in your opinion, how has it impacted that age set?
So it's actually hard to know exactly. And the reason is that we think about, for example, masking, and not having access to a face we know is important. Children look at faces. They certainly get visual cues, emotional cues, and so on. And when that's cut off, it does have short-term delays in that the child's ability to acquire those things. On the other hand, when a child's born blind and they don't ever have access to faces or visual cues, they generally learn to talk pretty well. Now, it's interesting. For example, their speech development is a little different. For example, in children who can see, B sounds and P sounds come in, and those are the most visible. Ba, ba, pa, pa. You can see my lips moving. Blind person, they don't see that, and so P and B, for example, don't come in necessarily as early as they do for children who are visual. But overall, people who are blind, who literally have no access to faces, have pretty much typical language development unless there's something else going on. So it's a little bit difficult to do the studies, but we do know in terms of development, in terms of academic achievement, in terms of social development, in terms of mental health issues in our teenagers, we know there's just been a huge number of impacts from COVID.
You're talking about, so a blind person not having access to seeing someone's mouth. The reason that these children didn't get to see a lot of mouths is because everyone was in masks.
Right. So another way to think about it is a blind person, actually, the areas of their brain that are developed for vision actually get transferred through neuroplasticity into hearing. And since they never had access to faces, it's not like anything unusual. But let's say I was like you're talking about your toddler. By the way, I don't want you to hear that somehow this was like permanently damaging to your toddler or something. I don't want you to freak out. But the toddler had access to mom's face, or maybe if the toddler was in daycare, they had access, and then suddenly they didn't. People's faces were all cut off in these different environments, and that alone is a little bit of a strange situation. So you could say they already had that exposure to faces, and then it was cut off in a weird and kind of capricious way that doesn't make any sense if you're a toddler. And clearly there were some impacts from that.
Well, and then the person wearing the mask, you're not able to project as well, right? So not only the visual aspects, but the auditory.
Oh, it has an impact on auditory, and one of the most notable things. So I part of my work. There are some late talking children who have hearing loss, and so as part of what I do is hearing loss. And in that case, late talking is a symptom of the hearing loss. That's why we always want to be sure we're checking children's hearing who are late talking. And I was working with I'm going to say she was 5 years old, kind of an early kindergarten or early school age child. And we had to wear masks at that point in our protocols. And she just started crying, and she said, "I can't hear you. Please take off your mask." She was using lip reading, and it was really important for her to even have access to the conversation because she was scaffolding her auditory information, which she had a hearing loss, so she didn't have as good access to the auditory stream, and she needed that visual. And it was really traumatic to her to have me wear a mask. And so, of course, I stopped the session, and then I actually petitioned our protocol people, and they did allow me then to have a clear face shield at that point that I could interact with the hearing impaired children. And at that point, they were really much more strict on the masking. That has its own journey, scientific journey. But at that time, our best advice, or the advice that was given, was to have the masking, and we actually got a waiver for the hearing impaired people just for that reason. So access to faces is really important, particularly in the toddlers and preschoolers.
Well, that's what I ask. How important is it to be able to see someone's lips and their mouth move?
It's really important. So again, we get cues from that, and not only that, not only us, but different kinds of like chimpanzees and so on. They just have this whole range of facial expressions. And again, if you take this away, eyes are still very expressive, but you get a lot more information from the whole face. And ironically, in autism, there's a kind of, I don't recommend doing this for lots of reasons, but a lot of people are trying to teach that the child with autism actually has an aversion to the face because of their reduced social motivation, and also the face is kind of complicated to read, which may not fit into the autism routine. And so we actually are trying to teach them to look at our faces. And certainly in autism, where we were masking, it was just really particularly devastating to the people with autism.
What about social distancing? We were told to stand 6 feet apart, even further at times.
Yeah. So again, if you think about proximity and how we have conversations, peer interactions, all that happens closer than 6 feet. And so all these mitigation things had an impact on social interactions, social development, and then also, speech and language development. And again, I don't want people to push the panic button. Our best guess is that it's relatively short term, and now that we're not masking and we're not distancing and so on, certainly that can be made up. But there are children that literally spent 2 years not experiencing school or preschool, or experiencing school or preschool where it was completely different in that there was distancing and masking.
Distancing and remote learning.
And remote learning as well, yeah.
So what kind of impact do you think that the remote learning had on speech and delays?
So one of the things that a lot of studies have shown is that there's something really beneficial about real-world interaction. So particularly for children with disabilities, and then also just in terms of typical language learning, this proximity that happens between a mother and a child, a father and a child, a caregiver and a child, that has to happen close within a foot or two of proximity, and it has to be directly contingent on what the child's doing in the moment. That's so important in our toddler and preschooler learning space, and that was really kind of derailed in many ways. Now, to be sure, many homes, the normal things were going on, but in community and in school and so on, that was completely shifted. And, as good as Zoom learning can be, and there are certainly some things we can do well with distance learning, it's just not the same as being face-to-face. And to be honest with you, there's quite a few studies to show that children just weren't attending as much to the screen as they would to a live person.
Well, there were also environmental impacts, right? Not everyone's learning setup was equal, right? There were some families where every child had to attend a different Zoom room, right? All lined up. Other kids were able to go into a quiet space, just them, and focus. Yeah,
and also the level of parent support to continue engagement also differed in different contexts. So just, mom or dad or a caregiver being there and kind of scaffolding and pivoting the learning was different. Taking a very complicated literature and oversimplifying it, I'll just say it up front. What happened is that the people who are most at risk, that includes people with disabilities and also people in poverty who have other stressors in their lives, they were clearly the most adversely impacted by COVID and the restrictions that happened. And, so kids that were kind of struggling, the example I use is there was achievement data that showed that in some school districts, for example, I'm not going to get into specifics because, it'll cause a firestorm in those districts, and I don't really want to do that. But the basic idea is that some districts, about 30% of the children were reaching grade level competency, say in math and reading, and after COVID, it was 0%. So we can say, gosh, only 3%, that's really bad. There's problems there. But in that situation, it was devastating. And then if you look at a comparison, school district that might have had 80 or 90% competency, they decreased, but it was like, they decreased like 60 or 70%. So there was still a majority of the kids that were at competency in that district. But the districts that already had, low performing, I'll say it that way, COVID just absolutely devastated those school districts and those students who were in those situations. And that's really a problem. I will say also, I wrote a Psychology Today column on this. What people should be doing in response is saying, okay, here's the basic information we need to teach. We need to go back and backfill that. That should be true for everybody, but for particularly these at-risk students. And of course, what's happening is they're just moving them along. They're not going back and filling in the lessons and the material and knowledge that's missing. They're just still benchmarking it to grade level. And so this weakness that's in there now because of COVID, I'm really worried they're baking it into that whole generation, and I'm really worried about that. And then, some of the kids, for example, with autism, it takes us a while sometimes to get the child to adapt and be able to be in the classroom. Sometimes it can take several months. And then post-COVID, all that work we did was completely undone. So we had to start from square one. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes when they went back to in-person learning and they were masking, the kids with autism couldn't handle that, so they couldn't be in the regular classroom. And then we adapted the masking, and the mask came off, and then that was a problem. And so It's just been a real journey for us in many ways. But the basic principles I've been talking about, saying, okay, we need to understand where the child is developmentally. We need to think about what they need in this moment for their learning. We need to think about what it is they need to learn in order to be a capable adult who's doing well in society, however we define well. We've got to be doing that. And just simply saying, okay, they lost 2 years, so now we're going to pack more homework on, or we're going to take this, kid who was second grade in COVID who's now in fourth grade, and we're just going to accelerate everything. That's not going to work. We need to go back and say, okay, what are the building blocks we've got to teach them? We've got to take the time to do that. That's crucial. Whether they're a late talker or not, that's really important.
I want to talk about not so much classroom settings, but therapies and treatments. During the pandemic, what was the access like for those families who were like, oh, okay, I have a late talker, boom, a pandemic hits, they can't get their child the support that they might have needed?
So in the early intervention and preschool services, it was really a problem because the children couldn't be made eligible. And one of the things I'm really worried about is like people started doing, for example, autism assessments remote. And I really, since the most important gold standard we have for autism assessment is clinical impression when you're actually working with a child in person, I can't imagine how you're going to do an autism diagnosis completely during video. Now, I do understand that, you can do some remote learning, distance learning, telehealth, and so on. There's a real place for that, and it's useful. But we have this group of people who kind of missed early intervention and preschool services and really even weren't made eligible either accurately or made eligible at all. And so that's another big problem that we now have to face, where the students have missed their service support for that year or 2 years.
What kind of words of encouragement do you have? Not all doom and gloom, right? You have some...
right. So again, the cool thing about what we talk about at the Late Talking Children's Foundation is that, in a way, what we need to do is the detective work. We need to be thoughtful. We need to say, okay, here's where this child is developmentally. Here's the vocabulary, here's the reading, here's the things we need to teach. And it doesn't matter how old the child is. So the fact that a child has missed some of those learning opportunities doesn't mean that we can't, if we're thoughtful about it, go in and backfill and scaffold them in a way that's going to be very positive. And it's not like all is lost and this child is, doomed to never having that. But we do have to make sure we're understanding the strengths and weaknesses that are unique to this COVID profile and use that in our thought and our programming.
I'll share a quick personal experience in regards to this. My oldest had lost 2 front teeth in wearing a mask to school. So the teacher never saw that the child didn't have 2 front teeth. And I get an email one day that just said, I noticed something's off about your child's speech.
Oh, right.
And Mary's very familiar with my child. She's like, oh, she's just fine.
Yeah.
But I mean, I just thought, how many other kids had that? And so when I was talking to Mary, like, what can we do? Because I think it also, like, the teacher being masked, people mumble, they're not always speaking clearly. We noticed like a lazy enunciation, plus not having 2 front teeth.
Right.
You can't say all
not
the words.
Having 2 front teeth will affect the sounds that are made up by the teeth, produced up by there. Yeah, right, exactly.
I mean, I feel like we're in a much better spot. I don't hear any difference now. The masks are off, the teeth are in.
And that's a good vignette. I mean, now if she did have a speech disorder, and the speech pathologist teacher were masked, and we were doing this, kind of where we were using what we call phonological or lexical recast, where the child says a word and we actually use the word and not the individual speech sounds as our teaching platform, they're going to miss that. And so, there are certainly reasons why the masking, could actually slow things down a lot. But I think your vignette is really good because the reality is that a lot of it can be made up. Another thing that's really cropping up in the literature, and part of the work I do is on social development and social interaction because it's very related to late talking and language. It turns out that the social isolation and the lack of access to peers and teenagers has been absolutely devastating. Not only because of social immaturity and things, and the things you learn day to day in interacting with peers when you're a teenager. Some of those may not be things the parents necessarily want them to do, but mental health challenges and some worse things have really arisen in a big way. And it's pretty clear it was because of the social isolation that happened to adolescents. It really has had more of an impact on females than males, although it's had an impact on both.
Well, it's great that you're talking about, because that's actually in my notes, because I have several friends who are teachers and counselors, middle school and high school counselors. And they all just happen to be in California, because that's where I'm from. And California saw longer mask enforcements than other states, like here in Tennessee where we are. And they, on our group chats are always saying like, man, I really worry about this group of kids. And they're all at different schools, right? All in the Southern California area. But they are seeing a lot of emotional problems, behavior problems. They don't know how to be together. They don't know how to just hang out.
Exactly.
And, it is what it is, right? We can't change what's happened, but moving forward, these are teachers who have been in the jobs for 20 years. So they've seen, they
have good instincts, and it's really reflecting that national data that I mentioned.
Yeah. So what kind of recovery time, how long will it take us to get past this little blip?
Right. So, in our toddlers and preschoolers, it's a lot like your vignette with your daughter in that, particularly if a child has either, of course, the late talking is a stage, they're just going to, progress. If it's a symptom, there's going to be longer term impacts. But, I think if we're careful and we don't bake that learning gap into the cake by not going back and making sure they know the things that they should have been learning naturally when they were 2 and 3 and 4 years old, it's not going to have any, significant long-term effect. On the other hand, you think about what we were just talking about in terms of social development and how that works. The answer is we just don't know, because if you think about it, this masking and this social isolation that happened in these early preteen and teen years, we've never had anything like that. And so we just don't know. My intuition is that what we want to do is be very supportive. We want to give the children opportunities to interact while also understanding that they may not have learned some of those lessons that are learned in these peer interaction groups, and that they might be 17, but, in terms of their peer development, they may be more like a 13 or 14-year-old. And those are very different maturational spaces, and trying to understand that and just making sure we're patient and supportive of our teens. They need that anyway, but these kids that came through COVID, I think we need to be particularly sensitive and supportive of them.
And people should know that in addition to your speech and child development skills, you also know a lot about behavior.
So I actually have been trained in behavior. I didn't actually get the certification, but I was offered certification as what's called a behavior analyst specialist. And actually, one of the people I work with a bit in my postdoc is one of the actual, one of the 3 kind of founders of the behavioral framework for doing research and doing treatment. So I have a lot of background and knowledge in behavior.
So when it comes to younger children, let's think like those who were in the pandemic early on, 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade, right? Now they're in middle elementary school. Right. Okay. How much of behavior problems can be linked to the pandemic versus finding out if maybe these kids actually do have ADHD or something? What kind of challenges are teachers facing in that kind of subset?
Yeah, that's really a very insightful question. So when we think about ADHD, and some kids who are mislabeled as ADHD because there's a mismatch between the level of the information they're being taught in the classroom and then their language ability. And so if you think about that, COVID creating a bit more of a gap. So let's say you have a 2nd grader who's now in 4th grade, but who still has the vocabulary of a 2nd grader. So they can't really understand what the teacher's saying, and so they're not paying attention or they're wiggly. Maybe you would mistake that for ADHD. And so, it's really important to be mindful of that. On the other hand, our basic differential diagnostic process will still hold true, and we want to think about that. But again, if the child has the vocabulary of a 2nd grader, we don't want to suddenly be dumping them on 4th grade achievement material when we really need to backfill their vocabulary, their reading vocabulary, their oral vocabulary. that, vocabulary is really important. We know from so many studies that vocabulary is such a strong predictor of so many different learning things. And if they've missed that, we need to backfill that and do remedial work to make sure that child gets up to speed. That's crucial.
Are you seeing a lot of kids coming in that might have been seen earlier but couldn't because of the pandemic, or maybe those problems weren't noticeable before?
We are seeing a lot of that. And so there's still a backlog of, so normally...
Like an overwhelming?
It is a bit overwhelming. In fact, I was, one of the clinics I work with that normally they get them in within a month. They're now looking at 6 and 8 months because of this giant kind of need in our community for kids that weren't seen, that normally would have been seen when they were 2. And you're basically looking at, your normal crop, your usual crop of 2-year-olds that are coming in. Then you also have a bunch of 3-year-olds and a bunch of 4-year-olds that are coming in that, weren't seen when they were 2 or 3. So yeah, it's really created a lot of challenges, downstream challenges for us.
Is there anything else that you want parents to know about the impact on child development through the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the most important thing in the takeaway message is that basically this forces us even more so to be mindful of meeting the child where they are, understanding that there might be some gaps in their knowledge that were the result of COVID, and not necessarily panicking, saying, oh, that critical period, that window's shut, my child's doomed to a life of whatever. We don't want to have that attitude. On the other hand, we want to say, gosh, in terms of, say, conversational things, nuances of conversation, some of these more nuanced social things, say for a teenager or a preteen, maybe they didn't get that. And so when they're doing something, it's important to step back and say, is this because of, like a disabling or a disorder kind of thing? Or is it that they missed that learning opportunity, and thinking about that and just stepping back. And then, of course, always, always, always meet the child where they are. That's just so important.
Let me tell you, as a parent, every time you say that, it just rings so true to my heart, because I just keep that in mind. It's okay. Like, don't get wrapped up in, they've got to be reading by the end of kindergarten or understanding. Yeah. They're going to get there, and every person's unique. So.
They will get there if you don't try to push it on them too soon and make it aversive for them.
Yeah.
So like with reading, if a child is, not yet ready to read, and you try to force them to read things that they don't understand, then you may actually be putting reading on the bad list, which you never want to do. And so maybe if a child's struggling to read, step back and say, am I teaching them in the right way? Am I nurturing them in the right way? And it becomes even more important in COVID, because children who normally wouldn't be struggling readers may now be struggling readers, not because of anything other than the fact that they were part of that COVID situation and learning situation.
I hope you take those encouraging words into your day, into your week, and we'll hope you join us here next week. We love having you here. Please stay with us. Check in as we work on more content for you. In the meantime, leave a question, a comment about today's episode, about last week's episode. We'd love to hear them all. Click subscribe so you can keep getting this information. Hit that bell. And of course, the Late Talkers Foundation website is a great resource for all of you.
And remember, the best thing for your child is you.